Hi guys, welcome to our daily encounter. Today in our New Testament reading in Hebrews chapter 7, we can see how this chapter is divided basically in two sections. The first section deals with Melchizedek and shows how Melchizedek's priesthood was superior to Aaron's priesthood. And that's significant because the scriptures prophesied that Christ's priesthood would be in accordance to the order of Melchizedek. But then as you get into the second section in verses 18 and down, it gets more specific to Christ and how Christ himself is superior to Aaron and the priesthood that followed from Aaron. And before we get into the different sections, it's important for us to define our terms. And the Hebrew writer had already done that in chapter 5 and verse 1, where he basically tells what the function of a high priest is. Says, "For every high priest taken from among men is appointed on behalf of men in things pertaining to God, in order to offer up both gifts and sacrifices for sins." So that's a pretty good definition. A high priest was one who was taken from men to basically intercede for man in things pertaining to God, doing it with sacrifices and gifts. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about the high priesthood of Aaron and then Christ as the high priest. These are men who were appointed to intercede for the people with sacrifices and gifts. Now, Melchizedek, as a priest of God, was superior to Aaron and his priesthood. And in chapter 7, in the first part, you have basically 5 reasons why he was superior. In verse 1, it says, "For this Melchizedek, king of Salem and priest of the Most High." It was superior, one, because he was a priest and a king. In the order of Aaron, that was not allowed. You were either a priest or you were a king, but you were never a priest and a king. And so that's significant. Melchizedek was king and also priest, so he had a very high status. But also he was one whom Abraham blessed. That blessed Abraham. After Abraham had gotten Lot and his possessions and really gotten back all the possessions of the king of Sodom, Melchizedek came and met him, and he blessed Abram. And then Abraham gave him a tenth of all. But the fact that Melchizedek blessed him showed that he was of a higher status. As a matter of fact, in Hebrews chapter 7, in verse 7, it says, "But without any dispute, the lesser is blessed by the greater." And that plays out in scriptures. If you go back and look at those who were blessing others, it was typically someone who was of a higher status or a higher position blessing someone of a lower status or lower position. And so that's an indicator that Melchizedek was higher than Aaron. We say, well, he did that to Abraham, not to Aaron. Well, he'll go on to say that Aaron wasn't born yet, and so he was, in a sense, in Abraham at that particular time. Abraham hadn't had any sons at that point, so all of his sons were in him. And so by virtue of the fact that Abraham hadn't had sons, Aaron hadn't been born yet, Aaron, in a sense, was there, present, being blessed by Melchizedek. And so Melchizedek was higher than Aaron. And you could also explain it by saying that Abraham was the father of Aaron, which gave him a higher status. And if Abraham's a higher status of Aaron, and Melchizedek's a higher status than Abraham, then it just follows that Melchizedek is higher than Aaron. But then it goes on to talk about the tithes, and it says, "Also Abraham apportioned a tenth part of all the spoils." And so Abraham gave a tenth of what he had to the king of Salem, to Melchizedek, which showed that Melchizedek was of a higher status. And he'll go on to describe that it's for the same reason, the fact that Aaron was still in the loins of his father. That's in verse 10. And therefore, by virtue of being still in the loins of his father, he himself paid tithes to Melchizedek, the same Aaron who received tithes from men. And so because of that, it shows that Melchizedek is of a higher status than Aaron. It says, and then by the translation of his name, King of Righteousness, and then also King of Salem, which is King of Peace. And so he was a king that brought righteousness, brought peace. It kind of plays along with that idea of him being both king and priest, something that wasn't allowed in the Aaron order. But then in verse 3 it says, without father, without mother, without genealogy, and having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like the Son of God, he remains a priest perpetually. And so Melchizedek's priesthood was one that never really came to an end, in the sense that he didn't pass it down to anybody else. In the Aaron priesthood, Aaron died, and then he passed it down to his son, and then his son passed it down, and it was distributed down that way. And so he had to pass it along. Well, with Melchizedek, that didn't happen. He just remained the priest perpetually. And so that made it superior. So for these different reasons, the order of Melchizedek is higher than the order of Aaron. Jesus was prophesied to be of the order of Melchizedek, so that makes Christ superior to the order of Aaron. But then in verse 18, actually you could back it up to verse 16. I said 18 earlier, but you could back it up to verse 16. That shows more specifically that Christ is more superior to Aaron. It says in verse 16, who has become such not on the basis of a law of physical requirement, but according to the power of an indestructible life. Aaron's priesthood was according to a physical requirement. You had to be the son of, a descendant of Aaron. Yeah, there was a physical requirement attached to it. But with Christ, he's a priesthood according to the power of an indestructible life. So the Aaronic priesthood, they died, passed it on, then he would die, they passed it on. But with Christ, he remains forever a priest because he's a priest according to this indestructible life. And then in verse 20 it says, and inasmuch as it was without an oath, for they indeed became priests without an oath, but he with an oath, through the one who said to him, the Lord has sworn and will not change his mind, you are a priest forever. You could go on to say, according to the order of Melchizedek. But God confirmed Christ with an oath, which was something that was peculiar and something that was specific to Christ. So that made him superior. Going on, talking about in verse 23, the former priests on the one hand existed in greater numbers because they were prevented by death from continuing. But Jesus, on the other hand, because he continues forever, holds his priesthood permanently. So his is better because the priests were limited by the years of their life. But Christ is not limited because he lives forever. And so he can be a priesthood forever and ever and ever, or a high priest forever and ever and ever. And then in verse 26, it says, for it was fitting for us to have such a high priest, holy, innocent, undefiled, separate from sinners, and exalted above heavens, who does not need daily, like those high priests, to offer up sacrifices, first for his own sins, and then for the sins of the people, because he did this once for all when he offered up himself. So he was without sin. The priests, according to Aaron, had to offer up sacrifices for themselves before they could even offer up sacrifices for everybody else. That wasn't true with Christ. He lived a life that was holy, innocent, undefiled, and separated from sinners. And then his sacrifice that he offered was better than the sacrifice that they offered, because it says he did it once for all. He offered up himself. And so the fact that the sacrifice he offered was better than those offered by the priests makes him a greater high priest. And then we see that they are weak, but he is strong. In verse 28, for the law appoints men as high priests who are weak, but the word of the oath, which came after the law, appoints a son made perfect forever. So they were weak because of flesh, because of death, because of sin. Maybe a lot of these things that were listed, but Christ was perfect forever. And he had the power of an indestructible life. He had the power of a holy life, and therefore is set apart from the priesthood of Aaron. So a long list of things that are found in Hebrews chapter 7 that show that Christ is the superior high priest. And that's a wonderful thing for us, because we need the best high priest we can get, right? We need someone who can come from among us. That is, Christ became a man, and so he was appointed as a man. He came from us, but he also intercedes on behalf of men in offering up things pertaining to God, to offer both gifts and sacrifices for sins in a much superior way than what they had under Aaron. And so we should be thankful that we have such a high priest, and that should give us confidence, as the Hebrew writer will say later on. It should give us confidence and boldness to go and approach God and to have a relationship with God, because we have Christ interceding for us at the right hand of God, dealing with things that pertain to God for us on our behalf. And that should give us confidence, it should give us boldness, and it should really humble us to know that he's doing it for our sakes. And it's not that we can approach God on our own merit, or that we are really good in and of ourselves, but we just have a great high priest who does his job well and helps us to maintain this relationship with God. So let's praise the Lord for that. And with that, I do thank you for watching the video today. Hope you guys have a great day. Love you guys. God bless.